Today's keynote speaker, Mr. George, Advocate of High Court of Delhi, Principal of Law College Dehradun, Dr. Poonam Rawat, President of Moot Court Society, Anna Anupriya, its Vice President, Danish, Convener, Mr. Rahul Kumar Sharma, Gauri Agarwal, and all the office bearer of Moot Court Society of Law College Dehradun, dear participants from different universities, I am taking this privilege to welcome you all on the behalf of Moot Court Society of Law College Dehradun, faculty of Uttaranchal University. Ladies and gentlemen, after successful session, two successful sessions of this lecture series, now in this third session, when we have a person who has practical knowledge of application of law, I hope this session will go, it will be interactive, meaningful, and useful for all of us. As I described last day also, Law College Dehradun is already organizing one lecture series of eminent jurists, research scholars, advocates, professors. That is regular, but during this period of COVID-19 lockdown, we were of the opinion that to make use of this period and at least impart some practical knowledge to our students, also the students, those who are participating from different university and abroad. So, as we have planned, and I have circulated to you also, we have taken all the topics on the basis of rather the criteria has been that the topic which are normally not studied in detail when you are in law college or law school. But these topics are equally important, rather they are more important when you go in actual practice. That is why we have requested these almost all the advocates, speakers in this series to give the practical knowledge to our students. Last two sessions, we have experienced that all important topics have been dealt with practical experience. Now I hope today also, since we have a very experienced advocate from Delhi High Court, Mr. George, that we will be having good deliberation, interaction, and this very good session. Not taking much of the time. Once again, I welcome all of you on the behalf of Moot Court Society and entire Law College Dehradun, Uttaranchal University family. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, without any further delay, we connect you to our speaker for today, Dr. Amit George.
Dennis, Mr. George is not connected.
Sir, 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 his voice is not audible to us. I think in the settings we need to change this thing.
Hi, sir, you're not audible. We are not able to listen to you. It's still not working, sir. We are not able to listen to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So nothing so
Yes.
far what I have said was audible to you.
No, sir.
Okay,
Not-
so then all right, no defect. There must be some system error. I'll just continue. So once again, thank you, Dr. Bahuguna, and thank you to the Moot Court Society at the Law College Dehradun for having me over today. So the topic which we've chosen for today is manifest arbitrariness. Now, before we really get into the nuances of the particular doctrine or the test, the reason why this topic is possibly of significant interest in contemporary times is because of the kind of power that it exhibits in terms of the judicial review paradigm. Now, as we all know, whenever we were in law school and even outside law school, once we start practicing, constitutional law is an area of the law that always, to a large extent, has primacy in our discussions or in our legal interactions. The reason for this is quite simple. The Constitution is the foundational document. It is the document which enshrines the rights and also the responsibilities of every Indian citizen. And it is basically the foundational document which protects not only our ability to be able to live a life which is in terms of the rule of law, but also represents a unifying factor on based around citizenship. Now, what is important about the constitutional doctrines is that, see, there are many articles in the Constitution. We are well aware of these articles: Article 14, Article 19, Article 21. All of these articles exhibit or reflect certain rights and certain guarantees which we all have as citizens. And many of these articles even extend to non citizens. Now, the guarantees are well and good, but ultimately, when we are of the view, any citizen is of the view that one of these guarantees in the Constitution is being violated by, for instance, a act done by a legislature, then we enter into the more controversial arena of how to implement these fundamental rights. Because it's all well and good to have a right in it, in the text of a statute or in the text of the Constitution, but if you are not able to articulate an entitlement to the enforcement of these rights, then frankly speaking, even the most high sounding ideals are really of no use. Now, therefore, what I want to speak about today is one of these doctrines which have now, let's say, if I may use the term, been significantly developed over the last few years in terms of handing out one extra weapon, if I may use the term, for a citizen to enforce his or her fundamental rights. Now, we therefore, when we enter into a discussion of this particular topic, kindly note that there are multiple mechanisms to test the validity of any state action, whether it be executive or it be legislative. Today's talk primarily centers around a test or a doctrine of enforcement of a right or a test of fidelity to constitutional values, which emanates under Article 14. There are many rights which are independent of this particular article, for instance, Article 21 or Article 19, though, of course, there is a significant amount of, let's say, interaction between these rights. But there are slightly different tests which can be adopted under each individual article. What we are concerned with today is the test under Article 14 and a specific test which is manifest arbitrariness. Now, therefore, with this in mind, I will now just invite your attention to this slide, which I will be playing simultaneously, so that we already have some reference point in terms of the text of the judgments which I want to rely on before you today. Now, there are many doctrines, many tests under the Constitution for, as I mentioned, judging either executive or legislative actions. But why is manifest arbitrariness chosen today? It is chosen for two reasons. One, it is in a certain sense a test which is considered by many to be an extra constitutional test, a test born out of complete judicial innovation, and a test which has been brought about as a way to ensure that in the appropriate circumstances, the judiciary has the ability, the judiciary has the power to be able to interfere with the legislative action, even if that action may pass muster through some of the traditional tests which we have followed for several decades. Now, this obviously creates a conflict. And this test has also been the subject of significant criticism by many scholars and legal practitioners because of its vagueness. But this is a doctrine which has witnessed significant adoption in the last few years, and increasingly so from Constitution bench judgments. And therefore, this doctrine is something which is definitely here to stay. Now, in this background, if we continue on to the real genesis of this doctrine, it is first important for us to consider and juxtapose this doctrine with what we have traditionally understood as a test under Article 14. Only then do we have an idea of why exactly this doctrine is innovative, or it is something which breaks the mold in terms of judicial precedent and thinking over the decades. Now, please bear in mind, under Article 14, if one has to have a precedent which has been articulated right from the initial days of the Indian Constitution, then such precedent will always take us to the classification test. So the classification test, or the traditional doctrine as it has been referred to by many legal scholars, is the test which we have been following for several decades. As opposed to this test, the arbitrariness test, or this new doctrine, as some scholars would like to call it, is something which is an innovation which arose more in the 1970s, then was subsequently buried by the Supreme Court, but has again seen a resurrection in the past few years. Now, therefore, to proceed with this, at the outset, why are these tests important? See, Article 14 is the article which is, interpreted by many to really form the bedrock of the Constitution, along with Articles 19 and 21. 14 is the classical article which protects us from all kinds of discrimination and posits to us as Indian citizens a right to equality before the law. Now, therefore, this is obviously a right which will come under strain through various legislative measures taken by the state for one reason or the other. And that it is for this precise reason that this article has been really the foundational basis for many constitutional challenges to legislations over the years. Now, therefore, this is something which we will see in our daily practice, in our daily life, as being implemented day in and day out as a test. Now, therefore, any innovation in a field which is so rampant with the prospect of litigation, such as an Article 14 challenge, is obviously of significant interest not only to law practitioners, but also to philosophers and general, let's say, persons who are interested in the development of constitutional law. Now, to first understand why these tests are so important, one must always remember that the standard understanding of the constitutional law paradigm in terms of the legality of legislative enactments has always recognized that there is a presumption in favor of constitutionality of a legislative measure. The reason for this is not far to speak. For instance, when we talk about the areas of influence or the spheres of influence, the judiciary is one of the wings of government. In a state, the judiciary is one of the wings, and an wing which is coterminous to the judiciary is the legislative wing. Now, just as the judiciary adjudicates, it is a sentinel and it protects fundamental rights, the legislature is sovereign in that sense in its sphere. The legislature, to use the literal term, legislates. Now, therefore, the standard understanding of the doctrine through the years has been that the legislature enjoys a presumption of legality in the actions it does which fall within its own sphere. Because under the constitutional scheme, in a democracy, we respect that the legislature, in a sense, embodies the mandate or the will of the people. And therefore, actions taken through the legislature, through a process of deliberation, which eventually result in a legislation, are always presumed to be legal and to be constitutional, unless the opposite is proved. Therefore, we are really in the realm of a rebuttable presumption as to constitutionality. But the reason why this is important to bear in mind is that therefore this is a presumption which operates against everyone who seeks to challenge a legislative action as being unconstitutional. Now, in this light, the Supreme Court therefore in 1950 itself very categorically observed that this is a presumption which attaches to legislative actions taken through the due process. Now, the classification test was therefore, when it was evolved with a certain deference in mind. Because ultimately, when you concede to the fact that the action of an entity is otherwise within its jurisdictional scope, then ultimately you cannot approach the question as one based on merit review. Now, when I say merit review as traditionally understood is something which not only looks at the process which resulted in the creation of something, but also undertakes an examination of the real merits of the decision in terms of its foundational basis, in terms of the rules which underline it, and in terms of its objective, and in terms of the impact it has on the constituents it seeks to impact. But since there was this fundamental presumption that there is going to be a presumption as to the validity of a legislation, we therefore had the court framing a very deferential test. Now, when I say deferential, as you will see from the slide, the court evolved a scheme or a test which only looked at two aspects: whether the classification a law was making was valid. For instance, there may be a law which says that under trial, that people who are incarcerated in jail are not allowed to vote. Now, therefore, if there was an Article 14 challenge using the classification test, you will first see the classification. Is it based on a intelligible differential? In this case, possibly yes, because you make a differential between persons who are in jail and persons who aren't in jail in terms of allowing them to vote. Secondly, you have to then take a look as to whether the classification has a reasonable nexus with the object sought to be achieved. Now, therefore, if you want free and fair elections, if you want to modulate the voting rights of people, you would possibly say that yes, such a classification does have a reasonable nexus with the object sought to be achieved by the law. Now, you will see in none of these twin tests under the classification doctrine are you entering into an inspection or an examination of the real merits of the measure. Now, therefore, we have an old adage that don't judge a book by its cover. Open the book, see what it is about, and then judge it. But the classification test, if you may call it that, essentially judges a book by its cover, in the sense that it has a very bird's eye view examination of the measure. And once the measure passes these preliminary tests, then the judiciary does not enter into a debate or a discussion on the merits of the law per se. So kindly note, the classification test is one which essentially only looks at the procedural soundness of the law in terms of the people it seems to impact and the classification it makes, while juxtaposing it with the object sought to be achieved by the law itself. Now, please note, the object sought to be achieved by the law is not being tested. What is only being tested is how efficient is the legislation, or how much fidelity does the legislation have to the professed objective of the law itself. Now, this obviously, if you see this doctrine, it has its limitations. Though, of course, more conservative views of the Constitution say this is precisely how a doctrine which looks at legislative action should actually operate, because you are not supposed to usurp the power of the legislature. But this doctrine, ultimately, if you see, does not really look at the actual underlying merits of the legislation. Now, if you look at the arbitrariness doctrine, before we enter into the complexities of the doctrine, this doctrine essentially goes deeper than the classification tests. Now, under this doctrine, you go beyond just the classification, you go beyond just the object of the law, and you now take a look as to whether the law can be said to be so arbitrary, so shocking, so completely without basis, that it actually violates the fundamental spirit of equality under Article 14. Now, one difficulty with this doctrine, which we will see as we pass through the slides, is that the term arbitrary isn't really defined. And after multiple Constitution bench judgments upholding this doctrine, utilizing this doctrine, there is not much of clarity as to the content of this doctrine. So then we will come to that. We'll come to the criticisms, we'll come to the evolution, but please bear in mind these preliminary differences while we go through the slides. Now, why did we have the classification test develop? See, one of the most popular understandings of why we had a differential test in the initial years of the Indian Constitution and its interpretation by the Supreme Court was that we did not follow the due process of law paradigm in our constitutional scheme. Due process of law, again an American doctrine, is one which is interpreted as looking at not only the procedural merits of a legislation, but is also concerned with its substantive soundness. Now, the Constitutional Assembly debates, and also I will obviously give a reference to the articles at the end of the PowerPoint, actually eschewed the incorporation of due process of law in the Indian Constitution, particularly in Article 21. Now, this was then reflected in the interpretation or the establishment of the classification test, in as much as we never adopted due process of law, but we moved more to the procedure established by law classification, in the sense in which we only looked at the procedure, but not really the underlying element of the soundness of the law itself, which actually established it in the first place. Now, subsequently, we therefore started to move towards a more expanded understanding of Constitution, and the due process of law slowly made an entry into our constitutional scheme of things. Now, this due process of law was also an innovation which came about in the years surrounding the emergency, when the Indian judiciary was under significant siege. Now, at the same time, we also had the development of the basic structure doctrine, which was also a response to what the judiciary perceived to be an onslaught of executive and political might, which actually threatened to completely obliterate the constitutional foundation. Now, therefore, in the 1970s, through Maneka Gandhi, etc., we see slowly the Supreme Court coming to a point of view that there is an independent test under Article 14 over and above the classification test, which can be implemented in certain circumstances. So Maneka Gandhi is the first judgment which actually incorporates, some people say through a backdoor, this principle of due process of law into the Indian Constitution. Now, therefore, having this broad background in mind, now we can quickly run through the judgments which actually incorporated due process as an essential element of the Article 14 test. Now, to give you a classical example of the classification test, the Supreme Court in a 7-judge bench decision in State of West Bengal versus Anwar Ali Sarkar articulated these conditions as follows. In terms of representing a classification founded on an intelligible differentia, which distinguishes between persons on a rational basis, and then links this differentiation to the object of the law, as we already discussed in the beginning. So this phrase is essentially a very succinct demonstration of how the classical doctrine of classification plays out on the normative level. Now, in E.P. Royappa, in the year 1974, you have one of the first articulations by Justice Bhagwati of this new test, independent test of arbitrariness under Article 14. Now, the way it was worded by Justice Bhagwati was that it was actually worded in a way in which any opposition to equality was considered and characterized as being arbitrary. Now, see, this slightly vague understanding, or slightly high concept understanding of what arbitrariness is, sort of continues in the judgments which follow after this. Because now, under Article 14, equality is now elevated to being a substantive right in terms of the test itself. Article 14 always recognized equality as a substantive right, but the test which was adopted by the Supreme Court never went into the formal merits of the challenge to equality and rested the case at a more of a procedural scrutiny level. Now, for the first time, we have Justice Bhagwati articulating the view that there is an independent test, possibly, which can be adopted by taking equality as a substantive aim itself in terms of a test. Now, when Justice Bhagwati then decides to actually enter into a larger analysis of this in Maneka Gandhi, now we have a slightly more evolved, though still vague understanding of what this manifest arbitrariness doctrine is. Because now we have equality really coming to the fore when Justice Bhagwati recognizes it as a dynamic concept within itself and recognizes it at striking at arbitrariness in state action and ensuring fairness and equality of treatment. Now, this test, therefore, now we see in these judgments, it takes on a life of its own over and beyond the classification test, which was in vogue all those years. Now, similarly, we have then a judgment in 1980 in Sunil Batra, where again the Supreme Court refers to arbitrariness as being an antithesis to the principle of equality under Article 14 and explicitly recognizing it as some sort of a test to be applied to legislative actions when determining constitutional validity. Another interesting aspect which comes to the fore is in the year 1981, where for the first time the Supreme Court says that this slightly vague test or this slightly vague exposition in terms of the concept of equality can now be tested to check whether there was state arbitrariness in state action, including legislations. Now, this is important because traditionally when we talk about arbitrariness, we talk about arbitrariness in the administrative law paradigm, where we are more concerned with examining the validity of executive actions. Now, for the first time, this doctrine, which of course textually also resembles the manifest arbitrariness or the arbitrariness test under administrative law, is now incorporated as a test of legislative action. So now kindly see the shift. We first have the recognition of arbitrariness as a distinct concept in the 1970s. And as judgments continue to come about, you then have an adoption of this test as something which can also be used to take a look at legislative action. So therefore, now you have an amorphous concept transcending or transforming into a concrete test in itself. Moving onwards, in R.K. Garg, once again, the Supreme Court seems to have taken a slightly more conservative view in terms of the fact that we must obviously defer to legislative judgment. But the Supreme Court at the end actually posits a sting in the tail, in the sense that the Supreme Court now says all of this is well and good, but if we find that there is a palpable arbitrariness, we will interfere. So there is, of course, deference which continues, but that deference is now conditioned with a warning, if I may use the term, that if something is palpably arbitrary, then there will be an interference by the Supreme Court. Now, where this really comes to the fore in terms of a larger evolution of the test is in the judgment in Indian Express newspapers, where the Supreme Court now says that this test under Article 14 is not really a test of reasonableness in the strict sense. Because when it is a test of reasonableness, you can always dovetail it with the first element under the classification test, which is the differentia reasonable or not? But now the Supreme Court says we did not really link it with that element of reasonableness, but there is an element distinct from unreasonableness, and which is manifest arbitrariness. Now, obviously, a lot of you will be having a question by now, what is manifest arbitrariness? Now, I wish that was something which would be clarified, but it's not been clarified, at least till this juncture. And as we move forward, we will have a better understanding of the concept, but the concrete, let's say, formulation as one finds in the classification test is something which doesn't really exist even till date. But we will come to that when we continue with the judgments. Now, in Lakshmanan, we have one of the first examples of the Supreme Court actually incorporating this doctrine in concrete terms while actually striking down a legislation. Now, the Supreme Court, as you will find very clearly from this exposition, now comes to the point and comes to, let's say, a stage of evolution in the doctrine where it essentially, to conclude a judicial determination of the validity of a legislation, now comes to the point that arbitrariness is lit large on the face of the provisions of a particular statute. Now here you see the conclusion reached by the Supreme Court is no longer founded exclusively on the classification test. In fact, the classification test seems, at least in this context, to be subsumed by the arbitrariness test. Now, moving on, we now come to a stage which is, of course, of significant controversy in terms of the development of the doctrine, where a bench of the Supreme Court takes a view to the contrary. Now, in a 3-judge bench decision authored by Justice Jeevan Reddy, the Supreme Court comes to the conclusion that we have moved too far away from the foundational principle of only exercising a limited judicial review of legislative actions, and that the law which has developed in the interregnum in terms of a more expanded understanding is something which does not owe fidelity to the original constitutional text and our original understanding of how judicial review of legislations was required to pan out in the Indian context. So if you see the highlighted portions in this particular observation in the judgment, the Supreme Court essentially articulates the basic criticism of this doctrine in the sense that the Supreme Court says that the judiciary is not supposed to second guess the legislature in terms of the wisdom underlying a particular legislation. And the Supreme Court categorically sets out that no specific legislative enactment can ever be interfered with simply by stating that it is arbitrary or unreasonable. Now, this therefore, we see the first ever exposition by the Supreme Court where the validity of the manifest arbitrariness doctrine is considered, and the Supreme Court takes a view that this is something which is alien to the constitutional text. Now, this McDowell judgment was read at that stage and also for many years subsequently as putting a nail in the coffin of this manifest arbitrariness doctrine. Now, but that was obviously not the last word on the issue. When we move forward, we see that there was a judgment in the case of Mardia Chemicals, and where the Supreme Court, without a detailed discussion in terms of the law expounded in the judgment by Justice Jeevan Reddy, which had actually frowned upon the use of the manifest arbitrariness doctrine, however, again seems to come to a view that certain provisions in a legislation, when so unreasonable and arbitrary, can by themselves violate Article 14 without looking at the test of the classification. Now, when we move forward, we again see a discussion in a 5-judge bench of the manifest arbitrariness doctrine, in which the court, though does not enter into an examination of the practical implication of whether this doctrine still holds good or not, generally does a review of the evolving nature of tests under Article 14. But even though this discusses both the test, classification as also arbitrariness, it does not definitively conclude or render an opinion on the vis-a-vis correctness of either of these doctrines. Now, we see another, if I may call it back, step back by the Supreme Court in terms of its jurisdiction under Article 14, when in the judgment in Rajbala, the Supreme Court, a 2-judge bench, reiterates the prohibition under McDowell and comes to the conclusion that it is impermissible for the court to render a statute unconstitutional on the ground that it is arbitrary. So we see this back and forth, but as of now, in terms of judgments which specifically deal with the normative permissibility of the test of manifest arbitrariness, we now have 2 judgments on the point, specifically disallowing or frowning upon this test of manifest arbitrariness. Now, if we move forward from here, now we have in 2017 what many scholars refer to as the resurrection of the manifest arbitrariness doctrine. Because in the judgment in Shayara Bano, which of course dealt with the legitimacy of triple talaq, the Supreme Court now, especially through the opinion of Justice R.F. Nariman, incorporates or revives the doctrine of manifest arbitrariness as a substantive test in itself. Now, while it does so, it also says that the judgment in McDowell is not only per incuriam, but also that the observations in the judgment as regards the scope of judicial review are self-contradictory, and that the shackles placed by the judgment on the ability to review a legislation on the ground of manifest arbitrariness is not borne out from the constitutional scheme. Now, therefore, in Shayara Bano, you have a forceful opinion which contends to the contrary and actually revives this test in our constitutional scheme of things. Moving on, in Shayara Bano, there is then an explicit recognition by the court that this test is not only alive and kicking, but it is a test which can also be specifically used to strike down legislation. Now, this view taken by a 5-judge bench, specifically in one opinion authored by Justice R.F. Nariman, takes the view that this test is back. Now, of course, there are some contestations in terms of whether this actually forms the opinion of the majority or not. Because even though the opinion by Justice Nariman was also joined by a co-judge, the casting vote, if I may call it that, of Justice Kurian Joseph, which actually invalidated the triple talaq, did not specifically agree with the manifest arbitrariness doctrine. So there was some controversy as to whether this opinion could actually revive the test by itself. But then when we move on to the judgment in Puttaswamy, 2017 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court, which of course again dealt with the right to privacy, we have a recognition of this test both in the majority and the minority opinions. So therefore now we see a 9-judge bench in both opinions essentially relying on and validating the test of manifest arbitrariness. Moving on, the conclusion to the story in terms of the incorporation of the manifest arbitrariness doctrine can therefore be best felt in the judgment in Navtej Singh Johar. Now in Navtej Singh Johar, which dealt with the constitutional validity of section 377 of the IPC, the Supreme Court now comes to the view that if there is manifest arbitrariness, then the legislation is definitely bound to be interfered with. So now we have a 5-judge bench, the opinion of various judges in that 5-judge bench, which incorporates and specifically makes reference to manifest arbitrariness as a doctrine which can be used to set aside or interfere with legislation. Now, this is obviously an interesting element, because if you see the judgment in Navtej Singh Johar, there has been a review of Navtej Singh Johar purely from the prism of the different portions of the opinions rendered by the various judges, which actually use manifest arbitrariness, and the different elements which they feel come within the rubric of manifest arbitrariness. Now, therefore, if you see on your screens, there is a significant amount of elements, significant number of elements, and a wide scope of examination, which the judges then utilize and come to a view that all of these elements, in terms of failure to recognize certain forms of sexual intercourse, the stigma it actually results in to members of the LGBTQ community, and the fact that disproportionality of a certain measure, all of these are now considered by the court to be elements which would fall within the rubric of manifest arbitrariness and therefore justify interference with the legislation or the legislative measure in question. Now, if you see, therefore, this is one of the best examples of why manifest arbitrariness is a wide doctrine, because unlike the gridlocked nature of the classification test, manifest arbitrariness essentially brings into light or encapsulates every provision or every element of a legislation which can be said to violate the fundamental basis of equality under Article 14. So now when you look at, even though we are not able to arrive at a precise explanation or a definition of what is manifest arbitrariness, we are now able to decipher that any form of shocking unreasonableness, any form of shocking disproportionality, any form of, if I may use the term, a very, very obliterative effect which the provision itself may have on the life or the ability to lead a fruitful life with equality under the Indian Constitution, all of these elements now come within the rubric of manifest arbitrariness. Now, when we go on to the judgment in Joseph Schein, we now see that the Supreme Court specifically once again interferes with a statute. This is, of course, the provision in the IPC which had criminalized adultery. And the Supreme Court now specifically strikes down this provision on the ground that it is not rational from any angle whatsoever, and therefore cannot be upheld when we use the test of manifest arbitrariness. They also bring in elements as to how this provision essentially treats women as chattel, about how it is disproportionate, how it is excessive, and all of these discussions then ultimately end up as a, if I may use the term, as a combined effect of the Supreme Court coming to a conclusion that there is indeed manifest arbitrariness in the way in which the legislation operates. Now, When we look at this doctrine from all of these judgments, we can decipher three essential elements. This doctrine is by its very nature widely worded. It utilizes tests which are far more subjective than the classification test. See, make no mistake about it, the classification test also is worded in reasonably wide terms. And there have been many judgments where, even though the strict understanding of the classification test would not have resulted in a finding of constitutional invalidity, the court has essentially modified or stretched the doctrine to such an extent that it has brought elements of substantive merits also into the examination of the classification doctrine. But at least the classification doctrine textually owes significant deference to the ability of the legislature or to the right of the legislature to basically legislate in terms of its own sphere of influence. But when we look at manifest arbitrariness, now we have the judiciary adopting a measure which permits, in appropriate circumstances, for the judiciary to examine a legislative measure on the merits, examine the wisdom underlying the legislative measure on the merits, and examine the effect that the legislation has on the people on which it will be applicable to determine constitutional validity. So now it depends on where you are coming from. This test can either be something which represents too much of a jump, alien to the constitutional text, or it can represent for you a natural evolution of the process of judicial review to take into account parameters and aspects which would otherwise not have been raised if we strictly followed the classification doctrine only. Now, this raging debate is essentially something which is, very difficult to typify or quantify in terms of, like, say, a few voices. But for all of us to actually debate on this issue, to actually have a dialogue on this issue, it is important to have some basic understanding of the difference between them. Now, when we've gone through all of these judgments, we've obviously understood the normative difference between these two tests in terms of the scope in which they operate and the realm in which they operate. But when we look at this particular doctrine, what we must understand, and I think this is probably one of the most succinct explanations of what this doctrine essentially represents differently from the classification test, when you have Professor Tarunabh Khaitan saying that the essential difference between these two is in terms of, the trigger. Because he says that the classification doctrine is essentially comparative. It will lay down certain goalposts and it will compare the legislation with those goalposts, and that's it. But when you look at arbitrariness, you are no longer comparing. You are eschewing the comparison, which means that you don't really need a standard in the strict sense. And you are then entering into the controversy of whether the legislation is substantively correct or not, as opposed to only a procedural review, which talked about the comparative elements of classification, reasonable classification, intelligent differentia, etc., etc. Now, therefore, when we talk about the classification doctrine, the classification doctrine, therefore, really represents equality in the strict conservative textual sense. Because the classification doctrine says you have to be equal. In order for you to be equal, we will take a look at how somebody in the same position as you is being treated. And if we find on a comparison that you are being treated differently from that particular person or entity, we will strike down the legislation. But when we talk about arbitrariness, the court does not really have to identify, in the strict sense, some other person who is being treated differently from you, even though he or she should not be. The court can simply look at a legislation, find that it is shockingly arbitrary, manifestly arbitrary, and proceed, therefore, to strike down the legislation as being constitutionally invalid. While doing so, the court now is also able to take a look at what is the impact that the legislation has on the people, rather than just looking at its procedural validity. Now, obviously, as I said, there are various views and counter views as to whether this doctrine essentially is something which is doctrinally correct, irrespective of the positive results it may actually bring about in certain circumstances. But that, of course, is a debate which rages. But there is obviously certain valid and legitimate criticism of this particular theory. Because firstly, as we've seen till now, manifest arbitrariness as a concrete doctrine remains elusive. It remains inherently subjective. And when I say subjective, I mean subjective in the sense of the viewpoint or the judicial ideology of the judges who will test this particular legislation on the basis of the doctrine. Now, this, of course, is true of various other tests. It is inherent in the nature of judicial adjudication, some form of subjectivity. But ultimately, when we come to a test which cannot be defined in concrete terms is by its very nature a little problematic for obvious reasons. Now, of course, we have H.M. Seervai, the constitutional law doyen, who obviously was very, very critical of this doctrine when it was first getting evolved, and was very unequivocal in the view that this is something which is alien to the constitutional text and to the constitutional objectives. Now, the important aspect about the difference between these two as practitioners, what is important for us to understand is this is a significant weapon in the hands of a party which seeks to challenge a measure. Because if you use the manifest arbitrariness doctrine, various legislations which have otherwise been upheld on the ground that they met the classification test are now vulnerable to invalidation. You are therefore now confronted, depending on which side you are on, with either a significant weapon in the armory of a citizen to test a legislative measure, or if you see it from the other side, you essentially have an unruly horse, which is difficult to really categorize or define in terms of its efficacy and its application, and therefore represents an unreasonable encroachment by the judiciary on the power of the legislature to actually be able to legislate in its sphere of dominance. Now, I have obviously at the end, now these are some very, very good articles or pieces and some very, very extensive discussions with regard to the element of manifest arbitrariness. You can, for those of you who are interested further in terms of the nuances of the doctrine and a really in-depth study of the doctrine, can essentially take a look at the suggested readings, which will basically give you a better overview. Now, if you ask for my opinion at the end of all of this, in my view, of course, there are certain normative problems with the test of manifest arbitrariness. But if you are a believer in the fact that the judiciary is essentially a counter-majoritarian institution, in the sense that its very purpose, its fundamental purpose, is to ensure that the view of a brute majority, even if it has legislative sanction, cannot be permitted to ride roughshod over a constitutional guarantee, then in that sense, manifest arbitrariness is an essential tool for the judiciary to be able to play that part. Now, of course, playing this role, as we all know, should not result in a complete usurping of the power of the legislature. But the limitations with the classification test, in terms of what I said, that it only judges a book by its cover, will essentially result in the judiciary not being able to take a particular proactive stand in favor of citizenry if it only applies the classification test. And therefore, in the appropriate circumstances, in my personal opinion, the manifest arbitrariness doctrine gives the requisite leeway, it gives the requisite flexibility for legislations to be tested and for legislations to be invalidated when there is a gross violation of the significant underlying factor of equality, which is really the fundamental basis of our constitutional values. So that, of course, is my opinion. And but yeah, this is obviously a matter of significant controversy and debate, and we won't be seeing the end of this dialogue or debate for a long time to come. So again, like I said, this is a very complex issue, constantly evolving issue, and 1 hour monologue is not really sufficient to get to the depth of the matter. But I hope this essentially results in greater discussion and debate amongst yourself, either in a physical or a virtual environment, and whereby I think we can better thrash out the modalities of this particular doctrine. Yeah, so that's it for me. Any questions or any other suggestions? Then yeah, the moderators may kindly take over.
Thank you, sir, for lightening us with your views. Sir, we have been receiving questions on our group chat and email also. Some of them have been shortlisted for you.
Yeah.
So kindly answer them, please, sir.
Yeah, please.
Good evening, sir. I have one question. Sir, will the CAA pass the test of classification as a nexus cannot be established between the object of the act and the classification provided in the act because of the absence of object in the act? Because in the act, the object is only given that it is being done for the amendment only. And in addition to that, how will the CAA will not fall in under further test of manifest arbitrariness rather than the reasonable classification? So,
right. So see, actually, the first question is something which essentially relates to the classification test, and there are numerous authors who have taken the view that it fails the classification test. There is, of course, the counterpoint also. But your second part is the second part of the question is what I am more interested in. See, because if now, like you rightly mentioned, if we were to use the classification test alone, then all we would be doing is we would be looking at whether you have equals being treated unequally. And that is obviously a very limited paradigm to look at the CAA. But now if you utilize the manifest arbitrariness test, there are various other dimensions which you can use to examine the CAA. For instance, there is a criticism that the CAA dilutes secularism, which in the view of many authors is a part of a basic structure. Now, basic structure by itself, of course, would apply. That is a distinct test in itself. But now if you come to manifest arbitrariness, there would obviously be an argument that what this legislation actually does, even if it does not fall afoul of the stricter rule of classification, by the effect it has on certain persons living within the territory, by the fact that it is disproportionate, by the fact that it will negatively impact a large section of the population, by the fact that its underlying basis is unreasonable, it is something shocking. And as we see in the section 377 challenge, the Supreme Court also adopted this manifestation of the reflection of some form of morality as a guide to striking down section 377. So therefore now, if somebody were to argue that the visualization of the CAA only considers India as being a refuge for a particular religious denomination, then possibly you will be able to mount a challenge on that front also to manifest arbitrariness. Question you asked, because the CAA is a very good example of how when you apply manifest arbitrariness, the range of arguments you can raise to challenge the CAA is far wider than the options or the arguments that you could have raised if you were to only stick to the classification test.
We have one more question, sir.
Yeah.
The question says that, do you believe that manifest arbitrariness must be equated with disparate impact, and does limiting or extending the scope of arbitrariness will make it more sophisticated towards equality and discrimination?
Right. See, that's a very interesting question. See, ultimately, the problem with the doctrine today is that it does not have, let's say, very objective parameters in terms of arriving at the ultimate result. Now, see, every adjudication by a court, whether it be a constitutional issue or a normal statutory issue, there are certain elements which gridlock the jurisdiction of the court. For instance, if you have a provision under a particular statute which permits a court to review a particular decision or a quasi-judicial order, there will be certain parameters. Can the court treat it as a first appeal, or can the court only exercise revisionary jurisdiction? Or say in the case of the Arbitration Act, is it a very limited jurisdiction like Section 34? So every time a court adjudicates, there is a certain element of gridlocking, whereby your jurisdiction to a certain extent is constrained and defined. Now, with the manifest arbitrariness doctrine, that definition is lacking. Now, therefore, if you ask me whether a certain amount of streamlining of the doctrine or bringing into effect, let's say, certain restrictions judicially will better serve it in terms of legitimacy, yes, it definitely would. But see, the entire purpose behind evolving the manifest arbitrariness doctrine was that if there is a gross case, the judiciary should be able to intervene. So by the very nature of the test, it is a little allergic to being gridlocked. Because if you try to gridlock it, then to a large extent, you are taking away the entire purpose behind the test being brought about in the first place. So I agree with you that, in order to be more doctrinally perfect, lesser open to criticism, it is important that, this test be more circumscribed. But whether that is essentially serving the purpose for why it was brought about, that is a very moot question. I'm not sure if, that would actually serve the purpose.
So putting one more question to your answer.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the contours of the doctrine needs to be defined as
Right.
recently advocated by our law minister as well?
Right.
Moreover, what do you feel that if defined, will it help improve the legislative competence, or will it give an added benefit to the legislature to define or to make a law within the defined contours?
Yes, absolutely. See, part of that criticism which flows from the political executive is for the reason that when you have a goalpost, see, when you play sports or, let's say anything, when you have a goalpost or when you have a defined set of rules, you are able to base your action on those rules. And therefore, you are able to analyze objectively, empirically, as to how do you structure your course of action so that it is recognized as being constitutionally valid and will survive any challenge in the future. Now, that essentially is what the political executive hints at, and which is a legitimate request or a legitimate demand to be made, because ultimately, if you accept the fact that these wings, these are entirely distinct from each other, and each of them operate in their own sphere of influence vis-a-vis the judiciary and the executive, the different limbs of governance, then naturally it is legitimate to ask for some sort of a sounding board or some sort of a set of rules on which you base your decisions. But see, the difficulty with having rules is, as we've seen from the history of legislation in our country, that every rule is open to being overridden or manipulated. So you may have the most stringent rules put in place, but there will always be a way for intelligent minds to be able to come up with a legislative measure which textually is in consonance with the particular rule, but actually has results which are completely debilitating. To give you an example, there was an issue which came with regard to segregated housing before the Supreme Court, with regard to cooperative societies in Bombay, which only permitted members of a particular religion to be members and to buy flats in the society. This is a very common occurrence in Bombay. Now, when this was challenged before the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court used the classification test, it found nothing wrong with the practice. But generally, when we look at it, when we look at a particular person being debarred from, say, going ahead, and purchasing a property, even if it is in a private entity, then naturally you would obviously feel that, there is something wrong with it if you apply the manifest arbitrariness doctrine. Though, of course, in the cooperative societies case, there were other issues like horizontal discrimination, etc., whether private entities at all can be said to discriminate. Those are wider issues. But one problem with laying down rules as such is that the legislature, and we have history about this, is then able to structure a legislation in purely legal and correct terms, even though the effect of the legislation might be extremely problematic. And I'm sure we will have this debate being brought about even in a much more ferocious term when we have the arguments in the CAA cases being addressed. Because this is precisely going to be the response of the government, that once our law is textually sound, it does not violate the classification test, you cannot second guess our wisdom or our underlying motive. So I don't entirely agree that, that the judiciary should give up that power in terms of gridlocking the doctrine, because by its very nature, it's difficult to gridlock the doctrine. One possible solution some people have given is that you should only have the doctrine in reference to the basic structure. That if there are elements of the basic structure which a legislation violates, then you can bring it under manifest arbitrariness, but not otherwise. But then the question remains, basic structure also by itself is again a slightly amorphous concept. And therefore, there is no perfect answer. My personal opinion is that this doctrine by its very nature cannot be gridlocked. So if you ask for it to be set in stone, then it's as good as not having the doctrine.
So I would put a last question to you,
Sir.
Or maybe a second last question.
Yeah.
Is it necessary to have a full spectrum judicial review of a law in order to ensure the rationality of a law?
See, when you say a full spectrum review, generally when we talk about full spectrum review, we talk about a possibility for a de novo application of mind. So if I am allowed to do a full spectrum review, I am allowed to apply my mind to every element of a decision, every single element. Now, for instance, there might be a law which comes into place, which essentially says that senior citizens, or say any category of persons, will pay a slightly lesser amount as, say, for a particular service. Now, if I do a full spectrum review, I am entitled to see if they have been given a rebate of, say, 100 rupees, is 100 rupees correct? Should it not have been 65 rupees? Should it not have been 20 rupees? Should it not have been 200 rupees? So when you say a full spectrum review, you say every single element of the decision is open to being reviewed. That I don't think is the mandate of the constitutional scheme, because then essentially you are making a super legislature. The judiciary in that sense, combines the functions of a legislature, possibly also the executive and the judiciary, if it applies a full spectrum review. Therefore, I don't think full spectrum review is really required or desirable. But if not a full spectrum review, a review to the extent of manifest arbitrariness is something which I personally believe is something we require.
Sir, adding to the same question, can we say that the ground of challenge under the manifest arbitrariness doctrine goes beyond the challenge to the object of the act? And if it does not go beyond the object of the act, is it not in essence similar to the doctrine of classification?
Right. I fully agree with you that it is similar in the extent that, but I mean, obviously it only goes beyond the classification doctrine to the extent that it looks at the objective. Now, see, the difficulty with, the reason why it does not just stop there is because it also looks at the effect that the legislation has. So, right, you correctly pointed out in the manifest arbitrariness doctrine, we go beyond we go beyond classification. We go beyond the adherence of the classification to the objective, and we actually start looking at the validity of the objective itself. But the manifest arbitrariness doctrine goes further, because it then also examines what is the effect of that measure on the ground level on the persons. So you may look at an objective and say this objective is fine. For instance, you may want to, there was this entire controversy about certain legislations which had proscribed the right of women to work. For instance, for women to work as bartenders. Now, if you only looked at objective, the objective would be safety of women. So essentially, if someone looked objective, you could always say, why would you want women to work in a bar where their safety might be compromised? So if you look at it only from the point of view of objective, that legislation might be valid. But if you start examining the effect that has on women itself, in terms of curtailing the right to employment, in terms of being paternalistic, in terms of not allowing them the full spectrum of opportunities, and actually because you're not able to ensure security, you actually try to curtail their freedom. Now this sort of a review is only going to be possible if you also look at the effect. And therefore, while I agree that the largest leap that manifest arbitrariness takes is in terms of looking at the objective, but I think it also goes further and looks at the effect also, and that opens up a huge area of argumentation.
Sir, question for today's session. Sir, as you said, doctrine of arbitrariness
Right.
legislation otherwise would pass the test of classification.
Right.
In the case, there is a clash between doctrine of classification and arbitrariness.
Right.
Prevail, sir.
See, there is no question of a clash in the strict sense, because these are now recognized. If you recognize manifest arbitrariness, manifest arbitrariness is recognized as a distinct test. So therefore, if a particular judge hearing a constitutional challenge decides to adopt manifest arbitrariness, he or she need not in any way examine whether the classification test applies or whether the classification test results would be contrary to the manifest arbitrariness test results. So therefore, these are tests which are completely distinct. So if you ask me textually, they do conflict in some ways because classification is so narrow in comparison. But frankly speaking, in the real sense of adjudication, there is no question of a clash in the strict sense.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. With this, we bring the end to the question and answer session. Now, I would like to request Ms. Ananu, President, Moot Court Society, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. It is a matter of immense privilege for me to present the vote of thanks on behalf of the Moot Court Society of Law College, Dehradun. Without taking further time, I would begin by extending my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Amit George, who agreed to join us and shared with us so generously his knowledge on the subject of today. On behalf of all the attendees, I thank you for this wonderful learning experience. Next, I would take the opportunity to thank the college and university administration, Professor Dr. Rajesh Bahuguna, Dean of Law College, Dehradun, and officiating Vice Chancellor of Uttaranchal University, along with Chairperson of Moot Court Society, Dr. Poonam Rawat ma'am, who have been ever supporting to every endeavor we take upon. I would also like to thank Youth Bar Association of India, who have provided us with the technical support needed to conduct this webinar. And last but not least, I thank all the hundreds of participants who have joined us and attended the lecture, without which this learning experience would have been incomplete. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Allow me to speak for 1 minute.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Yeah, Dr. Bahuguna, please.
In fact, Dr. George, I've gone through the entire speech today, and really, this was very informative as far as students are concerned. And the topic which you have taken, that arbitrariness, you have developed this topic from the very beginning, and giving the definitions also, and both arbitrariness, antithesis, equality, everything which usually we are teaching in the classrooms. And but with this, you have arranged in such a way with the case study, right from Rayappa to Menka Gandhi to latest Johar and Muthuswamy. It was really very, very interesting to listen you on this topic. And as far as the second part of this, that question or answer, I felt that is the best part of it, the way you have replied. And the question which were asked by the student were really very, very interesting and meaningful questions. And it says that it means all the students, those who are attending, they were very particular about this topic, arbitrariness and manifest arbitrariness. I see the interest in your lecture the student has taken in such a way, and I personally would like to thank you, because you have not covered only single topic, basic structure also, due process also, everything you have related to it. And for this, you need my special blessing and my thanks lot of Dr. George. Thank you so much on the behalf of entire Uttaranchal University family. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bahuguna, for your kind words, and with your experience and knowledge in the field. Obviously, I'm very heartened to hear what you just said. Thank you, sir.